When Moon is in the seventh house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets and love will steer the stars. It's a famous line from the Age of Aquarius song. But what is the seventh house? And what does it have to do with astrology? Most of us are familiar with zodiac signs, but very few know the reason for their existence. You see, when they were first invented in ancient Mesopotamia, no one considered themselves to be an Aries or a Libra or any other zodiac sign. They weren't even meant for people. Their actual purpose was far simpler. Divide the sky into 12 parts, which roughly correspond to the 12 months of the year. Then assign a meaning to each part based on the season and agricultural activity. Basically, you had a calendar and a farmer's almanac combined with a system to track the gods themselves. After all, the planets were gods in the eyes of the ancients, and their names reflect that. Their neighbors in Egypt, however, didn't care as much for a yearly calendar. The flooding of the Nile was quite predictable. They weren't as dependent on knowing what the season was. What they did care about was a clock to tell them the time of day. Quite handy when you're building pyramids on a schedule. So, instead of dividing the sky into months, they divided it into hours. Only they used 2 hours for each section to keep the number at 12. Yeah, that's the origin of the 12-hour clock. An Egyptian boss trying to keep track of his workers. A few millennia later, around the time of the Persian Empire, the whole zodiac system was well established as a good way to predict future worldly events. So people started using it to predict events in their own lives. They quickly realized, however, the same thing that people realize today when they talk about their zodiac signs. Not everyone born in the same month will have the same life. This is where the Egyptian clock became important for astrology. It allowed people to know where in the sky, relative to them, were the planets at any given moment. And the most important moment was, of course, when the person was born. That's how the 3 Magi, Persian priests, find Jesus in the Bible. So, how does it work? As you may remember, both the clock and the zodiac divide the sky into 12 parts. So all you need to do is overlay one on top of the other. Only instead of hours, each section of the clock is called a house. These houses align the stars and zodiac signs to the position they were in relative to you at the time of your birth. And by doing so, create an astrological chart that shows yours. And by doing so, they create an astrological chart that shows you specifically instead of the entire world. And just like the signs, each house has a very specific meaning. Let's start with the first house, which is the most important house in any chart. Imagine the sun rising above the horizon, bringing with it the dawn. That is the way the ancients viewed someone's birth, and so they named the eastern horizon line the rising sign or ascendant, and it represents the first house, the birth of the person. Whichever sign falls in the first house is called the rising sign, and the entire zodiac is rotated to start from the rising sign when reading an astrological chart. The default first house is Aries, as shown in the picture, but note that the clock is flipped. That is because the signs move counterclockwise in the sky. So why is it so important to know which sign falls in which house? The answer is simple. Each house represents a different area of life, and the only way one can read the birth chart is by seeing which sign and which planets influence each of these areas. Here's a brief overview of what each house represents. The first house, as mentioned before, is the rising sign and represents the person himself. It can also represent an event when looking at an electoral chart. And generally speaking, the rising sign, the first house, is what dictates how the chart will look and function. In terms of anatomy, the first house is the head and the face. It also dictates the appearance of a person, how their body will be built, what they'll look like. The rising sign will also create the viewport through which we see life. If one is a Scorpio ascendant, life will seem much more tragic and unpredictable to them, while someone who is an Aries ascendant will consider everything to be under their own grasp and will be far more likely to try and achieve everything through their own actions. The second house represents the family one is born into: aunts, uncles, grandparents. It represents the formative years of a person. In terms of anatomy, it represents the mouth and the lips, the lower part of the face. With this representation, it is also associated with the income that a person has, especially from an everyday job. One can consider the second house, the food on the table, and what we are able to eat. As such, the second house also represents assets, such as money, gold, real estate, etc., that a person possesses. Lastly, the second house also represents what we value. After all, what we consider to be tasty is the parts that we will value, while a food that we do not like, we will be glad to throw away. So, the second house is also the values that a person holds, both in terms of what he appreciates and in terms of what he considers to be right and wrong. The selective part is the second house. When it comes to the third house, it mainly represents the siblings and friends of a person, usually the younger siblings, so younger brothers and sisters. It also represents the hands and lungs, and as such, it represents communication because the air from our lungs is what we use to convey ideas to others. And if someone is incapable of speech, then he can use his hands to signal. As a representative of the hands, the third house also represents our skills and our ability to use those skills to compete with others. So the third house is also the house of play and of hobbies. And lastly, our skill in handling others and our ability to communicate with them is what determines our courage. We are not afraid of things we are familiar with, of things we can handle. The fourth house represents one's mother, and it generally represents everything that we find comforting and comfortable, be it our own home, a car that we own that helps us get somewhere in far more convenience than public transportation. In terms of anatomy, the fourth house represents the chest. After all, that is the milk producing area that helps a mother feed her child. In addition, the relationship with a mother also dictates how our emotions will evolve as we grow up. So the fourth house represents emotional stability. The fifth house represents one's children, And in general, one can consider the fifth house the house of results, the house of the fruits of one's tree. It also represents investments, and it represents one's education, which allows a person to move ahead in the world and succeed. In terms of the anatomy, it represents the heart and the solar plexus. The sixth house represents work and routine. It is the house of our responsibilities. When it comes to household animals, pets, or even farm animals that someone possesses, they are represented by the sixth house as they are under the person's responsibility. The sixth house also represents debts that we take upon ourselves, such as loans, mortgages, etc. And it represents diseases which we must deal with in order to continue living our lives. In terms of anatomy, the sixth house represents the stomach, and it is quite interesting that the stomach is the center of commensal animals which live inside our bodies, specifically the gut bacteria. And again, we see the direct connection between the symbolism of those who are dependent upon us, be it pets or be it our own gut bacteria. The seventh house is located opposite of the first house, and this opposition is quite significant because, while the first house represents the person or event, the seventh house represents everyone in front of it. So, one can consider the seventh house the house of others, the most significant others being the spouse of the person, be it the husband or the wife, and it can also represent business partners. In general, the seventh house represents how we interact with those who sit in front of us and everything that results from that interaction. In terms of anatomy, the seventh house represents the hips, the balancing part, the middle part of our body. Aside from being the house of spouses and business partners, it is also the house of contracts and agreements, as in the business partnership requires a business contract to be legally binding, the same as a marriage is actually a legal agreement which represents the combination of two people's assets into one family. The interaction with others also makes the seventh house the house of business dealings. If someone is trying to open a business, the seventh house can indicate how successful will he be in dealing with clients. Again, those who will be in front of him. The eighth house is the second from the seventh, and as such represents not our family but instead the spouse's family. So, one can see the in-laws from the eighth house. It also represents everything that is sudden or hidden. Why? Because the eighth house, in terms of anatomy, is the private parts. As such, it also represents sexual activities and intimacy in general, everything that is not available to the public, everything that is private. It also represents general stability or lack thereof, as the eighth house is also the house of sudden events. In fact, the activity in the eighth house generally dictates whether a person will have a smooth life or one filled with drama. Lastly, the eighth house is the house of longevity, and if someone wishes to know how long will they live, this is the house they need to analyze, among others, but that is a story for another time. The ninth house is the house of our beliefs. how we view the world is seen through the ninth house. It represents teachers, gurus, rabbis, everyone who gives us an ability to understand the world, everyone who guides us on a certain path and allows us to create an ideology that will help us interpret what we see around us. And when I say ideology, it can be a political one or a religious one, but generally speaking, everything that shapes our worldview can be considered an ideology. It also represents our luck, because luck is, in part, something that we believe in ourselves. In a more religious sense, one can say that being the house of belief, well, the more you believe, the more luck you will get from your belief. The more support will the chosen deity provide. In terms of anatomy, the ninth house represents the thighs, and it is the first of the houses that represent the legs. It is quite interesting to note that if we compare that to it being the house of ideology, it is literally the path that we walk upon, the path that we choose for ourselves. Just like the seventh house being the opposite of the first and representing one's spouse instead of the person himself, the 10th house is the opposite of the fourth and represents the public actions of a person instead of what they do in their private home. It is the person's career and the person's actions in the world. And if the fourth house represents the mother, then the 10th house is, of course, the house that represents the father of the native. And as such, one can see that the position that the father obtains during his life is directly influencing the position that the native will try to obtain during their lifetime. In terms of anatomy, the 10th house is the knees, and it is the epitome of the phrase, one should die on his feet instead of living on his knees. At the same time, it is also the epitome of the phrase, standing on their own 2 feet. Again, the knees are the locking mechanism of our legs, and they are the part that allows us to stand up straight. So their importance is both in terms of standing up straight and proud in front of the entire world, and in terms of actually being able to stand on our own and act independently of others. The 11th house represents the broader social circle that we join into. It may be the list of friends on the social networks. It may be some organization that we join, or it may be just the people that we know but who are not part of the close friends circle. Those same people who we interact with also represent the clients we can have in a business, and as such they represent gains outside of a simple job routine, as in income from selling something to someone, an income from closing a business deal, etc. However, if one is not a businessman, but instead is focused on the career, the 11th house is still important because it is the second from the 10th. The 10th being the career, now the 11th is promotions. So the 11th house represents the ability to gain another step in the career, gain a new position, or simply gain a raise. Lastly, the 11th house represents achievements, be it in terms of medals one wins, or be it in terms of just realizing some dream one had over a new car or a new house or anything else of that nature. Being the 8th from the 4th, it is literally the upheaval of the 4th. So, again, something new about the car or the house. It can also represent gains not only from business but from investments, being the opposite of the fifth. So generally speaking, the 11th house can be viewed as the house of achievement in any sort of situation. The 12th house, on the other hand, is the house of losses. It is the last house of the entire chart, and it represents things we must let go of. It can represent monetary losses in terms of expenses. It can also represent, however, a loss of freedom, such as being confined in a jail or a hospital, or can represent isolation in terms of being in a different country, being far away from home, being far away from everything we know. It also represents dreams, as a dream state is also alien to us. We have no control over it. And it can represent addictions, substances that can create hallucinations, dreamlike states, everything that separates us from the everyday reality of the first house is in the purview of the 12th. In terms of anatomy, the 12th house represents the feet, which are the part that is most connected to the ground. So, on the one hand, it is quite surprising that this is the part that will represent dreams. However, the feet are the part that is hidden from the sun, that is stepped upon and is restricted from you. And continuing the theme of restricted from view, just like dreams, addictions, and in general isolation, the 12th house also represents bed pleasures and fantasies. And no, it is not a reference to feet fetish or something like that, more along the lines of once you are in bed, the feet are finally off the ground. You can relax and you can be yourself. This concludes the overview of the houses and their meanings. In the next video, we will go deeper into the meaning of the planetary positions in each of these houses and how the houses themselves interact with one another. I hope you found this video useful. Take care, and I wish you all the best.